is incomparably the most effectual as yet devised." "Your own?" I inquired. "One of your own invention?" "I am proud," he replied, "to acknowledge that it is, at least in some measure." In this manner I conversed with Monsieur Maillard for an hour or two, during which he showed me the gardens and conservatories of the place. "I cannot let you see my patients," he said, "just at present. To a sensitive mind there is always more or less of the shocking in such exhibitions, and I do not wish to spoil your appetite for dinner. We will dine. I can give you some veal à la Minot, with cauliflowers in velouté sauce. After that, a glass of Clos de Vougeot, then your nerves will be sufficiently steadied." At 6 dinner was announced, and my host conducted me into a large salle à manger, where a very numerous company were assembled, 25 or 30 in all. They were apparently people of rank, certainly of high breeding, although their habiliments I thought were extravagantly rich, partaking somewhat too much of the ostentatious finery of the Villecourt. I noticed that at least 2/3 of these guests were ladies, and some of the latter were by no means accoutred in what a Parisian would consider good taste at the present day. Many females, for example, whose age could not have been less than 70, were bedecked with a profusion of jewelry, such as rings, bracelets, and earrings, and wore their bosoms and arms shamefully bare. I observed, too, that very few of the dresses were well made, or at least that very few of them fitted the wearers. In looking about I discovered the interesting girl to whom Monsieur Maillard had presented me in the little parlor, but my surprise was great to see her wearing a hoop and farthingale, with high-heeled shoes and a dirty cap of Brussels lace, so much too large for her that it gave her face a ridiculously diminutive expression. When I had first seen her she was attired most becomingly in deep mourning. There was an air of oddity, in short, about the dress of the whole party, which at first caused me to recur to my original idea of the soothing system, and to fancy that Monsieur Maillard had been unwilling to deceive me until after dinner, that I might experience no uncomfortable feelings during the repast at finding myself dining with lunatics. But I remembered having been informed in Paris that the southern provincialists were a peculiarly eccentric people, with a vast number of antiquated notions, and then, too, upon conversing with several members of the company, my apprehensions were immediately and fully dispelled. The dining room itself, although perhaps sufficiently comfortable and of good dimensions, had nothing too much of elegance about it. For example, the floor was uncarpeted. In France, however, a carpet is frequently dispensed with. The windows, too, were without curtains; the shutters, being shut, were securely fastened with iron bars applied diagonally, after the fashion of our ordinary shop shutters. The apartment, I observed, formed in itself a wing of the chateau, and thus the windows were on 3 sides of the parallelogram, the door being at the other. There were no less than 10 windows in all. The table was superbly set out. It was loaded with plate, and more than loaded with delicacies. The profusion was absolutely barbaric. There were meats enough to have feasted the Anakim. Never in all my life had I witnessed so lavish, so wasteful an expenditure of the good things of life. There seemed very little taste, however, in the arrangements, and my eyes, accustomed to quiet lights, were sadly offended by the prodigious glare of a multitude of wax candles, which, in silver candelabra, were deposited upon the table and all about the room, wherever it was possible to find a place. There were several active servants in attendance, and upon a large table at the farther end of the apartment were seated 7 or 8 people with fiddles, fifes, trombones, and a drum. These fellows annoyed me very much at intervals during the repast by an infinite variety of noises which were intended for music, and which appeared to afford much entertainment to all present, with the exception of myself. Upon the whole, I could not help thinking that there was much of the bizarre about everything I saw. But then the world is made up of all kinds of persons, with all modes of thought and all sorts of conventional customs. I had travelled, too, so much as to be quite an adept at the nil admirari, so I took my seat very coolly at the right hand of my host, and, having an excellent appetite, did justice to the good cheer set before me. The conversation in the meantime was spirited and general. The ladies, as usual, talked a great deal. I soon found that nearly all the company were well educated, and my host was a world of good-humored anecdotes in himself. He seemed quite willing to speak of his position as superintendent of a maison de santé, and, indeed, the topic of lunacy was, much to my surprise, a favorite one with all present. A great many amusing stories were told, having reference to the whims of the patients. "We had a fellow here once," said a fat little gentleman who sat at my right, "a fellow that fancied himself a teapot. And, by the way, is it not especially singular how often this particular crochet has entered the brain of the lunatic? There is scarcely an insane asylum in France which cannot supply a human teapot. Our gentleman was a Britannia ware teapot, and was careful to polish himself every morning with buckskin and whiting." "And then," said a tall man just opposite, "we had here not long ago a person who had taken it into his head that he was a donkey, which, allegorically speaking, you will say, was quite true. He was a troublesome patient, and we had much ado to keep him within bounds. For a long time he would eat nothing but thistles, but of this idea we soon cured him by insisting upon his eating nothing else. Then he was perpetually kicking out his heels, so. "Mr. De Kock, I will thank you to behave yourself," here interrupted an old lady who sat next to the speaker. "Please keep your feet to yourself. You have spoiled my brocade. Is it necessary, pray, to illustrate a remark with so practical a style? Our friend here can surely comprehend you without all this. Upon my word, you are nearly as great a donkey as the poor unfortunate imagined himself. Your acting is very natural, as I live." "Mille pardons, mademoiselle," replied Monsieur De Kock, thus addressed. "A thousand pardons. I had no intention of offending. Mademoiselle Laplace, Monsieur De Kock will do himself the honor of taking wine with you." Here Monsieur De Kock bowed low, kissed his hand with much ceremony, and took wine with Mademoiselle Laplace. "Allow me, mon ami," now said Monsieur Maillard, addressing myself, "allow me to send you a morsel of this veal à la ce menu. You will find it particularly fine." At this instant 3 sturdy waiters had just succeeded in depositing safely upon the table an enormous dish, or trencher, containing what I supposed to be the monstrum horrendum informe ingens cui lumen ademptum. A closer scrutiny assured me, however, that it was only a small calf, roasted whole, and set upon its knees with an apple in its mouth, as is the English fashion of dressing a hare. "Thank you, no," I replied. "To say the truth, I am not particularly partial to veal à la what is it? For I do not find that it altogether agrees with me. I will change my plate, however, and try some of the rabbit." There were several side dishes on the table, containing what appeared to be the ordinary French rabbit, a very delicious morceau, which I can recommend. "Pierre," cried the host, "change this gentleman's plate, and give him a side piece of this rabbit au chat." "This what?" I said. "This rabbit au chat." "Why, thank you. Upon second thoughts, no. I will just help myself to some of the ham. There is no knowing what one eats, thought I to myself, at the tables of these people of the province. I will have none of their rabbit au chat, and, for the matter of that, none of their cat au rabbit either." "And then," said a cadaverous-looking personage near the foot of the table, taking up the thread of the conversation where it had been broken off, "and then, among other oddities, we had a patient once upon a time who very pertinaciously maintained himself to be a Cordova cheese, and went about with a knife in his hand, soliciting his friends to try a small slice from the middle of his leg." "He was a great fool, beyond doubt," interposed some one, "but not to be compared with a certain individual whom we all know, with the exception of this strange gentleman. I mean the man who took himself for a bottle of champagne, and always went off with a pop and a fizz in this fashion." Here the speaker very rudely, as I thought, put his right thumb in his left cheek, withdrew it with a sound resembling the popping of a cork, and then, by a dexterous movement of the tongue upon the teeth, created a sharp hissing and fizzing, which lasted for several minutes, in imitation of the frothing champagne. This behavior, I saw plainly, was not very pleasing to Monsieur Maillard, but that gentleman said nothing, and the conversation was resumed by a very lean little man in a big wig. "And then there was an ignoramus," said he, "who mistook himself for a frog, which, by the way, he resembled in no little degree. I wish you could have seen him, sir." Here the speaker addressed myself. "It would have done your heart good to see the natural airs that he put on. Sir, if that man was not a frog, I can only observe that it is a pity he was not. His croak thus, oog, oog, was the finest note in the world, B flat, and when he put his elbows upon the table thus, after taking a glass or two of wine, and distended his mouth thus, and rolled up his eyes thus, and winked them with excessive rapidity thus, "Why, then, sir, I take it upon myself to say positively that you would have been lost in admiration of the genius of the man." "I have no doubt of it," I said.